The golden horizon bled crimson as Abigail Montgomery knelt before the wooden cross, her tears falling silently onto the freshly turned earth of the Wyoming territory. The year was 1876, and the vast expanse of the frontier had never felt so empty or so cruel. "Jonathan," she whispered, her fingers tracing the crude letters carved into the crossbeam. "What am I to do now?" The wind offered no answer, merely tugging at her black mourning dress and the loose strands of chestnut hair that had escaped her bonnet. 3 weeks a widow, and the reality of her situation was only beginning to sink in. 22 years old, alone on a homestead 10 miles from the nearest town, with winter approaching and supplies dwindling. Abigail closed her eyes against the setting sun, remembering how Jonathan had promised her a life of adventure when they'd left Boston 2 years ago. "The West is where we'll make our fortune," he'd said with that boyish grin that had captured her heart at 16. Now he was gone, taken by a fever that had burned through him in less than a week, leaving her with nothing but a struggling ranch and mountains of debt. She didn't hear the approach of hoofbeats until they were nearly upon her. Startled, Abigail rose quickly, brushing the dirt from her skirts as she squinted at the silhouette approaching from the west. The rider slowed his horse to a walk, and as he drew closer, Abigail could make out the lean figure of a man atop a dappled gray stallion. His face was obscured by the brim of his hat, but she could see the dust of the trail coating his denim trousers and leather vest. "Evening, madam," he called, his voice deep and steady. "Don't mean to intrude on your grief." Abigail straightened her spine, acutely aware of her vulnerability. "What business do you have here, sir?" The stranger dismounted with fluid grace, leading his horse the remaining few yards. When he lifted his face to hers, Abigail was struck by eyes the color of a summer storm gray with hints of blue around the edges. He couldn't have been more than 30, with a strong jawline shadowed by several days' growth of beard. "Xavier Whitaker," he said, removing his hat in respect. "I was passing through these parts when I saw you from the ridge." He gestured to the hillside behind him. "A woman alone at dusk isn't something a man can ride past without checking on." "I'm perfectly fine," Abigail said, though her voice betrayed her. "This is my land, my husband's grave." Xavier's gaze moved to the cross, and something like understanding passed over his features. "Recent." 3 weeks, she admitted, hating the way her voice caught on the words. Xavier nodded slowly, then looked back toward the small cabin visible in the distance. "You're managing that place alone," pride made her chin rise. "I am." He was quiet for a moment, studying her with those storm-colored eyes. Then he said something that would echo in her mind for days to come. "The world's still wide enough for healing, madam, even out here." Before Abigail could respond, Xavier continued, sun's nearly down. "Wolves are getting bolder this time of year. Allow me to escort you back to your home." Abigail hesitated. Her mother had raised her to be wary of strangers, especially men on the frontier. But there was something in Xavier's direct gaze that spoke of honesty, and the thought of walking back alone as darkness fell suddenly seemed more foolish than brave. "Very well," she conceded. "But I warn you, Mr. Whitaker, I keep a loaded shotgun by the door." A small smile touched his lips, crinkling the corners of his eyes. "I would expect nothing less from a frontier woman." They walked in silence, Xavier leading his horse a respectful distance behind her. As they neared the cabin, the true state of the homestead became apparent. The corral fence was broken in places, the barn door hung askew on its hinges, and the cabin itself needed repairs to its roof and porch. "Your husband's illness kept him from the autumn preparations," Xavier observed, not as a question. Abigail swallowed her pride. "Yes." Jonathan was sick for nearly a month before. Before the end, things fell into disrepair. Xavier tied his horse to the porch rail and surveyed the property with a practiced eye. "You have livestock, 2 milk cows, 6 chickens, and Jonathan's horse. The rest we sold when he fell ill." She didn't mention the mounting debts, the mortgage payment due to the bank in Laramie within the month. Xavier nodded. "It'll be dark soon. I should be on my way." Relief and an unexpected pang of disappointment mingled in Abigail's chest. "Where are you headed, Mr. Whitaker?" "Nowhere in particular," he said, replacing his hat. "I'm what you might call a drifter, been working my way north from Texas." A cowboy, she said, understanding now his ease with horses and the weather-beaten quality of his clothing, among other things. His gaze returned to the dilapidated property. "Mrs. Montgomery," she supplied. "Abigail Montgomery, Mrs. Montgomery, I don't mean to overstep, but this place needs more work than one person can manage before winter sets in." Abigail's throat tightened. "I'm aware." Xavier seemed to wrestle with something, then made a decision. "I could stay on for a few days, help with the most pressing repairs, in exchange for meals and a place in your barn to sleep." Alarm flashed through her. "Mr. Whitaker, that would hardly be proper. Proper won't keep you alive through a Wyoming winter," he interrupted, his tone gentle but firm. "I give you my word as a gentleman that your reputation and safety will remain intact. But that roof won't fix itself, and that corral won't hold anything come the first snow." Abigail looked at her home, the home Jonathan had built with such hope and determination. Then she looked at her hands, already raw and blistered from attempts at repairs she barely understood how to make. "3 days," she said finally. "I can offer you 3 days' meals and shelter in exchange for help with the most critical repairs. Then you must continue on your way, Mr. Whitaker." Xavier nodded, satisfaction in his expression. "Agreed, we'll start at first light." And so began a partnership that neither could have anticipated as the sun set over the Wyoming plains. True to his word, Xavier was up before dawn, already assessing the roof when Abigail emerged from the cabin with coffee. He worked methodically, teaching her as he went so that she might maintain the repairs after his departure. "You need to understand the why of things," he explained on the second day as they repaired the corral fence. "Not just the how. The why tells you what to watch for when things start to fail again." Abigail was a quick study, and Xavier found himself impressed by her determination. She never complained, even when the work left her hands bleeding. By the third day, they had established a comfortable rhythm, working side by side during daylight hours, then retreating to their respective domains at nightfall, Abigail to the cabin and Xavier to a makeshift bed in the barn. Over simple meals of beans, cornbread, and what game Xavier managed to hunt, Abigail learned fragments of his story. He'd been a ranch hand in Texas, then a trail driver taking cattle north. He'd fought briefly in the closing days of the war as a young man, though he spoke little of that time. When she pressed about his family, he grew quiet. "Lost them to cholera when I was 16, he finally admitted on the evening of the third day. "Been making my own way since." Abigail's heart ached for the boy he must have been. "Is that why you drift, with no family to anchor you?" Xavier considered this as he stared into his coffee cup. "Perhaps, or maybe I just haven't found a place that feels right to stop yet." The 3 days passed too quickly. By the fourth morning, the most critical repairs were complete: the roof patched, the corral secure, the barn door rehung, and firewood chopped and stacked high against the cabin wall. As agreed, it was time for Xavier to move on. Abigail watched him saddle his horse, a heaviness in her chest she hadn't expected. "I don't know how to thank you properly, Mr. Whitaker." "Xavier," he corrected, tightening the cinch. "After 4 days of working together, I think we've earned the right to given names, Mrs. Montgomery." "Abigail," she said softly. He nodded, a small smile touching his lips. "Abigail." Then he reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a small book. "I noticed you don't have much to occupy your mind during the long evenings ahead. Thought you might appreciate this." It was a worn copy of Tennyson's poems, its leather cover softened by years of handling. Abigail took it reverently. "I couldn't possibly. I've memorized the ones that matter," he assured her, "and I can always get another." Their fingers brushed during the exchange, and Abigail felt a warmth spread through her that had nothing to do with the morning sun. She quickly withdrew her hand. "Safe travels, Xavier." He mounted his horse, looking down at her with those remarkable eyes. For a moment, something unspoken passed between them, a possibility, a question, a regret. "You'll manage now," he said finally. "You're stronger than you know, Abigail Montgomery." And then he was gone, riding toward the horizon, leaving Abigail standing in the yard with a book of poems and the strange feeling that something significant had just slipped through her fingers. The days that followed were filled with work. Abigail threw herself into maintaining the improvements Xavier had made and implementing others he had suggested. In the evenings, she read from his book of poems by lamplight, finding comfort in the cadence of Tennyson's verses. A week passed, then another. The first dusting of snow fell, and Abigail faced a new challenge, the mortgage payment. Despite her best efforts, she was still $20 short. The bank would foreclose, and everything Jonathan had worked for, everything she was fighting to preserve, would be lost. It was during a trip to town for supplies that the solution presented itself, though not in a way Abigail could have predicted. "Mrs. Montgomery," called Mr. Patterson, the owner of the general store, as she entered. "Got something for you." He produced a small package wrapped in brown paper. "Came with the mail stage yesterday." Puzzled, Abigail opened it to find $30 in cash and a brief note. "For services rendered. XW." Her heart raced. Xavier had sent money more than enough to cover the mortgage payment, with some left over for supplies. Pride warred with gratitude in her chest. "Good news?" asked Patterson, eyeing her flushed face. "A debt repaid," she said carefully, tucking the money into her purse. "Nothing more, but it felt like more. It felt like a lifeline." That night, as the wind howled around her cabin, Abigail made a decision. Come spring, when the roads were passable again, she would sell the ranch. She couldn't maintain it alone, and the memories of Jonathan were too painful. She would use the money to start fresh, somewhere else, perhaps in Cheyenne or Denver, where a young widow might find respectable work as a seamstress or teacher. Winter settled over the homestead with brutal efficiency. Abigail survived on her stores, occasional hunting trips, and the milk from her one remaining cow after she was forced to butcher the other. She learned to shoot Jonathan's rifle with reasonable accuracy and to set traps for rabbits. The isolation was the hardest part. Days would pass without her speaking a single word aloud. In those quiet months, Xavier Whitaker occupied her thoughts more than she cared to admit. She found herself rereading his note, tracing the bold slant of his initials, wondering where he was and if he ever thought of the widow he'd helped on a Wyoming homestead. It was foolish, she knew. He was a drifter, a man with the horizon in his blood. And she was still in mourning, still learning who she was without Jonathan. Yet in her dreams, storm-colored eyes followed her, and a deep voice reminded her that the world was wide enough for healing. February brought a blizzard that lasted 3 days, burying the cabin in drifts higher than the windows. On the 4th day, as Abigail dug her way out to check on her animals, she heard the distant report of a rifle once, twice, then a third time, the universal signal for distress. Abigail hesitated only briefly before retrieving Jonathan's rifle and firing 3 shots in response. Someone was in trouble in the blizzard's aftermath, and she couldn't ignore the call. Bundling herself in every layer she owned, Abigail set out in the direction of the shots. The snow was thigh-deep in places, and the going was slow and treacherous. After nearly an hour, she spotted a dark shape against the white landscape, a horse, its rider slumped forward in the saddle. As she drew closer, her heart nearly stopped. Even before she saw his face, she knew the dappled gray stallion, the worn leather vest visible beneath a heavy coat. "Xavier," she called, pushing through the snow faster now. "Xavier," he raised his head at her voice, and relief flooded his pale face. "Abigail," he breathed, barely audible. She reached him just as he began to slide from the saddle. Supporting his weight as best she could, Abigail lowered him to the snow, alarmed by the bright stains spreading across his left side. "What happened?" she demanded, pulling back his coat to reveal a crude bandage soaked through with blood. "Disagreement in Laramie," he managed through chattering teeth. "Thought I'd make it to the next town. Storm caught me." Abigail's mind raced. He was too heavy for her to carry, and the horse was exhausted. "Can you stand with help?" Xavier nodded grimly. Working together, they managed to get him back on his horse, with Abigail leading the animal through the snow toward the cabin. It was slow, agonizing progress, and twice Xavier nearly lost consciousness, but eventually the homestead came into view. Getting him into the cabin was another struggle, but once inside, Abigail worked quickly. She built up the fire, heated water, and carefully removed his blood-soaked clothing. The wound was a bullet graze along his ribs, painful and bloody, but not immediately life-threatening. The greater danger was the cold. Xavier's lips were blue, and he couldn't stop shivering. Abigail cleaned and bandaged the wound, then wrapped him in every blanket she owned. Propriety be damned, she knew enough about survival to recognize that body heat was what he needed most. She slid under the blankets beside him, pressing her warmth against his shivering form. "Scandalous, Mrs. Montgomery," he murmured, a hint of his usual humor returning despite his pain. "Hush," she said firmly. "I'm not letting you die in my bed, Mr. Whitaker. It would be terribly inconvenient." A weak chuckle escaped him before he drifted into an exhausted sleep. For 3 days, Xavier alternated between feverish delirium and lucid intervals. During his coherent moments, Abigail pieced together what had happened. He'd been in Laramie, playing cards with some locals. One man had accused him of cheating, and the argument had escalated. Xavier had escaped with the bullet graze, but not before leaving his accuser with a knife wound that might or might not prove fatal. "I didn't cheat," he told her, eyes blazing with fever. "Never have." "But a man can't let certain accusations stand." "Of course not," Abigail soothed, changing his bandage. "Now rest." On the 4th day, his fever broke. Abigail found him sitting up when she returned from tending the animals, color back in his face and clarity in his eyes. "You saved my life," he said simply. Abigail shrugged, suddenly self-conscious. "You saved my home. Consider us even." Xavier shook his head. "Not even close to even." He caught her hand as she moved to check his bandage. "Abigail, thank you." The sincerity in his voice made her throat tight. "You're welcome." Over the next week, Xavier regained his strength. The forced proximity created an intimacy neither had anticipated. They shared stories of their pasts, their dreams, their fears. Xavier spoke of his years drifting, taking work where he could find it, never staying in one place long enough to form attachments. "Doesn't it get lonely?" Abigail asked one evening as they sat before the fire, a respectable distance between them now that he was recovering. Xavier stared into the flames. "I've gotten used to it." "That's not the same as not being lonely." He looked at her then, something vulnerable in his expression. "No, it's not." The air between them seemed to thicken with unspoken thoughts. Abigail was the first to look away. "I'm selling the ranch come spring," she announced, changing the subject. "Moving to Cheyenne, perhaps." Xavier's brow furrowed. "Is that what you want?" "It's what makes sense. I can't manage this place alone indefinitely." "You've done admirably so far." Abigail shook her head. "Only because of your help, and even with that, it's too much, too many memories." Xavier was quiet for a long moment. Sometimes new memories can help ease the sting of the old ones. Before Abigail could ask what he meant, Xavier stood carefully, mindful of his healing wound. "It's late. I should let you rest." He had insisted on sleeping on a pallet near the fire since regaining consciousness, returning Abigail's bed to her sole use. Now he settled onto that makeshift bed, effectively ending the conversation. Abigail lay awake long into the night, thinking about new memories and wondering why Xavier Whitaker's imminent departure felt increasingly like a loss she wasn't prepared to face. By mid-March, the worst of winter's grip had loosened. The snow was melting, revealing patches of mud and the first tentative green shoots. Xavier's wound had healed to a red line along his ribs, and he moved with nearly his former ease. There was no reason for him to stay any longer. Yet he lingered, finding tasks that needed his attention. Repairing winter damage to the outbuildings, helping Abigail prepare the small vegetable garden, riding to town for supplies she claimed not to need. They fell into a domestic rhythm that felt both foreign and strangely right. Abigail cooked, Xavier hunted. They worked side by side during the day and shared quiet evenings by the fire. Sometimes he read aloud from the Tennyson book, his deep voice giving new meaning to the familiar verses. Neither spoke of his eventual departure, though it hung between them like an unasked question. Nor did they discuss the growing tension that manifested in held gazes and accidental touches that lingered a moment too long. It was during a spring storm, with rain lashing the windows and thunder shaking the cabin's timbers, that everything changed. Xavier had been checking the roof for leaks when a particularly violent gust of wind had torn a section of the repair loose. He'd managed to secure it, but not before being soaked to the skin. Abigail had insisted he change immediately, stoking the fire higher while he ducked behind the privacy screen with dry clothing. When he emerged, she was waiting with a towel. "Your hair is dripping all over my clean floor," she chided, handing him the cloth. Xavier chuckled, rubbing the towel over his damp hair. "Can't have that, can we?" "Here, let me," Abigail said impulsively, taking the towel back. "Sit." Xavier hesitated, then sat in the chair by the fire. Abigail moved behind him, gently toweling his dark hair. The domesticity of the act struck her suddenly. This was something a wife would do for her husband. The thought should have troubled her more than it did. "You have quite a knack for finding trouble, Mr. Whitaker," she said to cover her confusion. "Been told that before," he agreed, his voice low. "Though the trouble I find these days seems worthwhile." Abigail's hands stilled. "What do you mean?" Xavier turned in the chair to look up at her, his expression serious. "I mean that getting shot and nearly freezing to death led me back here. To you, can't say I regret it." Her heart thundered in her chest, drowning out even the storm outside. "Xavier, I know it's too soon," he said quickly. "I know you're still mourning Jonathan. I'm not asking for anything, Abigail. I just needed you to know that these weeks have meant something to me." Abigail's hands trembled as she set the towel aside. "They've meant something to me, too." A cautious hope flickered in his eyes. "Enough to reconsider selling the ranch?" The question caught her off guard. "What?" Xavier stood, careful to maintain a respectful distance between them despite the smallness of the cabin. "This land has potential, Abigail. With the right partner, it could flourish. I've been thinking about it with some capital investment. We could expand the cattle operation, maybe even breed horses. Wyoming territory is growing. There will be a market." Abigail repeated, her mind spinning. "I'm not proposing marriage," Xavier clarified, a faint flush coloring his cheekbones. "Not yet. That would be presumptuous. I'm proposing a business arrangement to start. I have some savings, not much, but enough to buy cattle come summer. We could be partners." Abigail stared at him, trying to process this unexpected turn. "You want to stay here, but you're a drifter. You've never stayed anywhere for long." "Maybe I've been waiting for the right reason to stop," he said softly. The implications of his words hung in the air between them, weighted with possibility. Abigail thought of Jonathan, his dreams for this land, his love for her. Would he want her to abandon everything they'd built together? Or would he want her to find happiness again, to make this home thrive? "I need time," she said finally. "To think." Xavier nodded, relief evident in his posture. It wasn't a rejection. "Take all the time you need. I'm not going anywhere." And for the first time, Abigail believed him. The next few weeks brought a flurry of activity as spring took hold in earnest. Abigail and Xavier worked from dawn to dusk, preparing the ranch for its potential new future. They repaired fences, expanded the corral, and cleared additional grazing land. Xavier rode to neighboring ranches, negotiating for 2 young bulls and a dozen heifers to be delivered after the spring calving season. All the while, Abigail wrestled with her decision. Could she truly build a new life here, with this man she'd known for such a short time? Was she betraying Jonathan's memory by considering it was during a visit to Jonathan's grave, now adorned with early wildflowers, that clarity finally came to her? She knelt in the soft grass, tracing the letters of his name as she had so many times before. "I miss you," she whispered. "I always will, but I think you would want me to be happy, to make our home flourish." The wind rustled the grass around the grave, and for a moment, Abigail felt a sense of peace she hadn't experienced since Jonathan's death. It wasn't permission exactly, but an acknowledgement that life continued, that healing was possible. When she returned to the cabin, Xavier was on the porch, whittling a piece of wood with his pocket knife. He looked up as she approached, his expression careful. "I've made my decision," Abigail said without preamble. Xavier set aside his carving. "And I'll stay, we'll be partners." The smile that broke across his face was like sunrise after the longest night. "Partners," he agreed, extending his hand. When their fingers met, Abigail knew with certainty that she had made the right choice. Summer arrived with its relentless heat and long, golden days. The ranch transformed under their combined efforts. The herd grew, the fields flourished, and the cabin itself seemed to shed its melancholy air. Xavier built a small cabin for himself on the property, a respectable distance from the main house, though they still shared most meals together. Their partnership evolved naturally, each bringing different strengths to their shared enterprise. Xavier had a gift for animal husbandry and an innate understanding of the land. Abigail proved adept at managing their finances and negotiating with merchants in town. Together, they balanced each other in ways neither had anticipated. As for their personal relationship, it developed with cautious patience. There were lingering glances, hands that brushed during shared tasks, conversations that lasted late into the evening. But Xavier never presumed, never pushed beyond the boundaries of propriety, even as it became increasingly clear that his feelings ran deeper than business partnership. It was Abigail who finally broached the subject on a warm July evening as they sat on the porch watching fireflies rise from the grass. "My year of mourning ends next month," she said quietly. Xavier's profile was silhouetted against the darkening sky. "I know. In the eyes of society, I'll be free to consider other attachments." He turned to face her then, his expression serious in the fading light. "Is that something you're ready to consider, Abigail?" She met his gaze steadily. "I've been considering it for some time now." The admission hung between them, fragile and momentous. Xavier reached across the space separating their chairs, his calloused fingers gentle as they closed over hers. "I never expected to find a home," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "or someone who makes me want to stay in one place. But you've changed everything." Abigail's throat tightened. "As have you." They sat in companionable silence as darkness fell completely, their joined hands a promise of possibilities to come. In August, exactly 1 year after Jonathan's death, Abigail wore a blue dress instead of black for the first time. She visited his grave in the early morning, leaving wildflowers and quiet thanks for the life they'd shared. When she returned, Xavier was waiting, hat in hand, looking uncharacteristically nervous. "I thought we might ride to town," he suggested, "if you're feeling up to it." They spent the day in Laramie, shopping for supplies and enjoying the simple pleasure of being among other people. Xavier surprised her with dinner at the hotel restaurant, a luxury Abigail hadn't experienced since leaving Boston. As they rode home under a canopy of stars, Xavier guided his horse close to hers. "I have something to ask you, Abigail, something I've been wanting to ask for a long time." Her heart quickened. "Yes." He reined his horse to a stop, and Abigail did the same. In the moonlight, his features were cast in silver and shadow, but his eyes held a warmth that needed no illumination. "I'm not a man of great means or refined background," he began. "I've spent most of my life wandering, never putting down roots, but with you I've found something I never knew I was searching for, a home, a purpose, a partner in every sense." Xavier dismounted and moved to help Abigail from her saddle. When they stood facing each other, he took both her hands in his. "Abigail Montgomery, would you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife?" Tears welled in Abigail's eyes, but they were tears of joy, not sorrow. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I will." Xavier's smile was incandescent as he drew her into his arms, his kiss tender yet filled with promise. When they finally broke apart, breathless and laughing, he pressed his forehead to hers. "I should warn you," he said, "I still don't know much about being a husband." Abigail smiled, her heart fuller than she'd thought possible. "And I'm still learning how to run a ranch. We'll figure it out together." They married in September, a small ceremony at the church in Laramie with only a handful of neighbors and the pastor as witnesses. Abigail wore a cream-colored dress she'd sewn herself, with wildflowers in her hair instead of a veil. Xavier stood tall and proud in a new suit, his hair trimmed and face clean-shaven for the occasion. "I never thought I'd find love again," Abigail confessed that night as they stood on the porch of their home now, truly. "After Jonathan died, I thought that part of my life was over." Xavier drew her close, his arms a shelter she'd come to cherish. "The world's still wide enough for healing," he reminded her, echoing the words he'd spoken that first day by Jonathan's grave. "And for second chances." And for love, Abigail added, rising on her toes to kiss him. Especially for love, he agreed. The years that followed brought challenges, as all years do. There were harsh winters and summer droughts, market fluctuations, and the occasional disagreement. But there were joys too. The ranch flourished under their care, expanding to become one of the most prosperous in the county. Their partnership, both in business and in marriage, grew stronger with each passing season. In the spring of 1878, their family expanded with the birth of a daughter, named Rebecca after Xavier's mother. 2 years later, they welcomed a son whom they called Thomas. The children grew strong and resilient, learning to ride almost before they could walk, inheriting their father's affinity for animals and their mother's quick intelligence. Jonathan's grave remained a peaceful place on the hillside, tended with care and respect. Abigail brought the children there sometimes, telling them stories of the brave, kind man who had first brought her to Wyoming. It was important to her that they understood their home's history, all of it. "Mama, why are there 2 crosses?" asked 5-year-old Rebecca one afternoon as they laid wildflowers on the graves. Beside Jonathan's marker stood a smaller cross, weathered but well-maintained, bearing no name. Abigail knelt beside her daughter, smoothing a hand over her dark hair so like Xavier's. "That's for remembering," she explained. "Your father put it there to remind us that sometimes when we lose something precious, we have to grieve, but we also have to keep our hearts open for new blessings." It had been Xavier's idea, that second cross a memorial not to a person but to the sorrow that had brought them together. "So we never forget how we found each other," he'd said as he placed it beside Jonathan's grave with Abigail's blessing. By 1885, the X-Barham Ranch, as they'd come to call it, combining their initials, was a landmark in the region. They ran cattle on thousands of acres, bred some of the finest horses in the territory, and had built a new, larger home to accommodate their growing family, which now included a 3rd child, another daughter, Grace. Xavier, once restless, had found in fatherhood a joy he'd never imagined possible. He taught his children to ride and rope, to respect the land and its creatures, to understand the responsibility that came with their good fortune. Abigail watched him sometimes, this man who had once claimed to have wanderlust in his blood, now so thoroughly rooted to their shared life, and marveled at how love transformed. On the 10th anniversary of their marriage, Xavier surprised Abigail with a trip to Denver, their first real journey away from the ranch since their wedding. They left the children in the capable hands of their foreman's wife and boarded the train, both excited and nervous about their temporary freedom. Denver was a revelation after the relative isolation of ranch life: theaters, restaurants, shops filled with luxuries they rarely indulged in. They stayed in a grand hotel, attended a concert, and for a few magical days, remembered what it was like to be simply Xavier and Abigail, not parents or ranchers or employers. On their last night, as they strolled along the gaslit streets after dinner, Xavier pulled Abigail into the shadow of a shop awning and kissed her with the same fervor that had marked their wedding night. "Scandalous, Mrs. Whitaker," Abigail teased when they parted, echoing his words from that winter night so long ago. Xavier laughed, the sound rich with happiness. 10 years, and you're still the most beautiful woman I've ever seen." Abigail blushed, feeling girlish despite her 32 years and 3 children. "Flatterer, truth-teller," he corrected, tucking her hand into the crook of his arm as they continued their walk. "I was thinking about that day I found you by Jonathan's grave, how lost you looked, how alone." "I was," Abigail acknowledged. "I couldn't imagine finding my way forward. And now." She smiled up at him, this man who had changed her life in ways she could never have predicted. "Now I know that even the deepest grief can give way to joy, that endings sometimes lead to the most unexpected beginnings." Xavier nodded, his eyes reflecting the lamplight. "The world is wide enough," he murmured, "for healing," Abigail finished, "for love, for everything we've built together." They returned to the ranch renewed, ready to face whatever challenges the future might bring. The Wyoming Territory was changing rapidly around them, towns growing into cities, railroads connecting once isolated communities, the promise of statehood on the horizon. But through it all, The X-M remained their anchor, their legacy to their children and to each other. As they crested the final hill on their journey home, the ranch spread out before them, the house with smoke curling from its chimney, the barn and corrals, the grazing cattle dotting the lush pastures. Their children raced out to greet them, faces alight with excitement. Xavier drew his horse to a halt, reaching across to take Abigail's hand. "What a life we've made," he said softly. Abigail squeezed his fingers, her heart full to overflowing. "Yes," she agreed, "what a wonderful life." And as they rode down to meet their children, Abigail thought of that long-ago day when a stranger had found her crying by a grave and offered words of hope. The world had indeed proven wide enough for healing, for love, for the family they'd created together. Wide enough for all the joy and sorrow, the struggles and triumphs that made up their shared story. Wide enough for everything that mattered.